If the net result of the Iran war is lower global growth, demand destruction for oil, lower demand for oil, Russia suffers through lower global oil prices, less exports because of the Ukrainians, and that's the nightmare scenario for the Russians.
Semtex was found on the ground next to one of those Ukrainian transport jets. Is this now Putin and Russian intelligence mounting an operation in a NATO country that could have resulted in the loss of aircraft, loss of life on a large scale?
I mean, had this thing gone off, it would have been a huge story. Hello and welcome to the Fourcast Indicators. I'm Matt Frei.
And I'm Mark Urban. And this is the podcast where we look at the signals that analysts watch out for most closely, the telltale signs that suggest the world could be on the brink of some major change.
Later, we'll bring you the latest on Iran and the emerging deal between Tehran and Oman over the Strait of Hormuz. But first, we're taking a deep dive into the war in Ukraine, which we do increasingly. In recent weeks, the conflict appears to have entered a new phase. Ukraine has launched increasingly ambitious long-range strikes deep inside Russia, put mounting pressure on Crimea, and sought to bring the war closer to millions of ordinary Russians. Now the Kremlin is hitting back and hard. So are we witnessing a dangerous new phase of escalation, as predicted in one of our previous podcasts? Mark, your first indicator, please, on this question.
Yes, I think there's no doubt that the events at Leipzig airport yesterday are potentially...
Just remind us very quickly what they were.
I will. Potentially very significant. Now, it's a logistics hub. It's used by the Ukrainian Antonov heavy lift transport aircraft that obviously used to be based in Ukraine but can't fly from there now because of the war. And also it's the major European hub for DHL. And actually it was one of the targets in a previous plot to put bombs on aircraft in 2024, which I think is widely assumed by European intelligence to have been run by the Russians, that they were attempting to send a warning signal. Now, yesterday, there were apparently 2 drone incidents at that airport. In one of them, a DHL plane taking off, I believe, hit what subsequently turned out to have been a drone and damaged its nose. And in the other, a drone with an explosive warhead, Semtex no less, according to the German police, was found on the ground next to one of those big Antonov, one of those Ukrainian transport jets. So the question is this now Putin and Russian intelligence mounting an operation in a NATO country that could have resulted in the loss of aircraft, loss of life on a large scale, and been a really dramatic signal that Western support for the Ukrainian military supply chain was now going to be a target for attack.
Why
so
would they do that?
Quite a big
potentially,
step.
I mean, had this thing gone off, it would have been a huge story. Why would they do it now if the Russians are behind it?
Is it the response to what we've seen? Is it Putin saying, okay, if you hit my oil refineries and you darken the skies over Moscow and Petersburg, we have ways of bringing home the war to you guys too. I mean, fascinating. We don't know. Obviously, it's going to be hard to work out exactly how this was done and who did it, because there's every possibility, given the nature of the drones used. They're the sort of ones, the hobbyist ones, that early on in the war were very much a feature of the front line, but have since been displaced by far more capable ones. But the sort of thing you could buy in a store, fit with explosives, and have to be launched from pretty nearby. So there's no way these things flew from Belarus or Russia itself. They will have been launched by someone quite near to the airport in Germany. And so there will be a whole investigation as to who could have done that.
And the timing of this in political terms in Germany is very delicate, because on the 6th of September, we have elections coming up, Land elections, state elections, in Saxony-Anhalt, which is right next door to Leipzig. Leipzig is in the state of Saxony. Saxony-Anhalt is just further to the north. The AfD, which is notoriously quite pro-Russian, certainly not pro-Ukrainian, that party on the far right of German politics has done better and better and is now leading in the polls in most of Eastern Germany, but also doing very well in West Germany. In the state of Saxony-Anhalt, they're scoring something like 42%. That is a huge amount. If they were to win this election in September, which many people think they will, there's going to be a very delicate question for the Christian Democrats, who might be the second party in that state. Do they dismantle their firewall, where they keep the far right always out of power, and go into coalition with the CDU, with the AfD? This would be a new precedent in German politics. It would cause shockwaves across Europe. When we talk about this war, we like to focus on things like warehouses, the warehouse war, and we focus on the big stuff in the front line. There are other dimensions here, and the Russia's desire, if not always ability, to influence, to get into the bloodstream of Western politics, democratic politics, and try and influence them has become well established. Doesn't always work. That doesn't mean they're not trying.
Yeah. And I think this thing will probably play out at many levels, won't it? There will be the European counterintelligence experts who assemble the case against Russia, that they did this, and will tell their political masters, no, this is a signal related to the uptick in deep strikes by the Ukrainians, and an attempt to tell us in the West that Russia has the means and the will now to make us pay more of a price. But at the popular level, it may play out completely differently, as you've suggested, with pro-Russians in whichever country saying, "Oh my Lord, we can't take this risk." So, I mean, it could be the beginning of something quite fascinating. All the more so if you imagine, as in the case of some of the other recent incidents, where it's believed that Russian intelligence agencies have used online recruitment to get people to carry out acts in European countries, if they choose Ukrainians to do it, which is quite possible because that's happened several times already. Listen, the ins and outs of this Leipzig airport attack, none of us can know yet. Another key indicator, which is a curious one, and I think will have escaped the attention of the vast majority of our viewers and listeners, is that on Tuesday of this past week, President Zelensky's announced 40-day campaign against Russia of intensifying strikes came to an end. Now, if you
did you know there was a 40-day campaign?
Well, I did, but that's because I'm paid to worry about these things, so our listeners don't have to.
I realised it on day 35, I think. I mean, I'm going to be honest about that.
No,
I
noticed him. Okay, so Volodymyr Zelensky has a bit of a weakness for these. If you look back to the August of 2 years ago, that's when they launched this military attack into Russia in Kursk.
It didn't go so well.
Well, it ended up, not going great. No, and many people say a waste of valuable people. But why does he do it? Now, the avowed purpose of this one, the thing that's just ended, a little bit like that attack into Kursk, was to bring Russia to the negotiating table. Well, the 40 days were up on Tuesday, with obviously no sign of Russia coming to the negotiating table, perhaps even the cue for Russia to launch its attack in Leipzig and give its answer that way, if indeed it was Russia. But I think the fascinating thing now for Zelensky is, okay, so he's had that sort of political moment where he tried to provide a logic for these intensified strikes deep inside Russia, the oil installations, the distribution warehouses, and of course, many ships in the Black Sea being struck also during that 40 days. That was the logic that was given. This is an intensification designed to bring Russia to the table. So what does he do now? He hasn't brought Russia to the table. Can he sustain these? Now, I was talking to somebody with fascinating insight and access just yesterday who said, that the track in terms of delivery of cruise missiles and long-range strike weapons is still looking very positive over the next few months.
That's interesting, because I've heard the opposite.
And therefore, Ukraine can sustain these deep strikes. But, it'll be interesting to see them giving the rationale and the logic for this campaign as it goes forward.
So maybe Putin doesn't want to come to the negotiating table because he's been given a bloody nose and he needs to give a bloody nose back, and he doesn't want to go to the table in a position of perceived weakness especially from the Americans. So in that sense, it hasn't achieved its purpose. On the other hand, Guess who's coming to Kyiv sometime very soon, perhaps next week? That dynamic duo of diplomacy, Kushner and Witkoff. They have been to Moscow, I think between them 8 or 9 times since they came back to office. How many times have they been to Kyiv? Zero.
Yep.
Not once.
Yep.
They're going, apparently it's planned for next week. Now, we also know that Zelensky saw Trump when they put Lindsey Graham, the late senator, to rest last week on the Capitol. They had a discussion then that apparently went very well. Apparently they are, according to my sources, Washington and Kyiv are in daily contact much more than they have been for a long time. And then I remember that phrase that Zelensky told me in his palace when I interviewed him, a few years ago. He said, he suddenly broke into English in this interview. He said, nobody likes a loser. And that's been his and that's where he's understood Trump. Trump loves a winner. And when Trump said to him famously in that awful Oval Office exchange, you've got no cards, it seemed to Trump at the time as if he was losing and therefore he could trample all over him. And that is no longer the case, right? That is no longer the case. But I still, just quickly, what I'm hearing is that the reason why the 40-day campaign is over is because they've literally run out of the ATACMS and these other long-range missiles that they use in order to target refineries and warehouses. So maybe that's why it's come to an end.
No, I don't think so. And in fact, the last 2 days, they've been firing away since technically this 40 days ended. No, I don't think that's the issue. And in fact, if you look at the pipeline, the various different projects, they've got a big project with Norway. They've got various projects with the UK.
So they're going to get their
deep strike weapons.
They're getting their
Yeah. So I think there will be a pipeline.
As are the Russians.
There will be a pipeline through the coming months to maintain these strikes. And going back to your point about nobody likes a loser, I mean, it's a fascinating point. Fascinating to hear that Zelensky said it. I mean, the view one hears from Washington is that Director Ratcliffe of the CIA has been in the last few months on the mission of convincing Trump that Zelensky is a winner. And those images of black skies over Moscow and burning facilities and all the rest of it have been very helpful.
Trump is very visual, right?
Yeah.
And so those images would have really impressed him. He does everything through picture boards, as we know, in that wonderful book that Maggie Haberman and her colleague wrote about Trump regime change. It's all about picture cards, as if he was a film producer or a reality TV impresario. He wants to see what it looks like. And I guess those images of Moscow and St. Petersburg refineries and warehouses burning are very, very impressive. And again, we're going to talk about this later with our guest, but, targeting these wild berry massive depots, they're almost as big as Amazon depots. They're huge, and it is the kind of Amazon version of in Russia. I mean, that does hit at something in the economy. It interrupts supply lines. The Ukrainians are saying for military stuff, but actually probably mostly for civilian stuff. And it really hits small-scale Russian companies. And I've read that if you've got your stuff in one of these wild berry warehouses from which they distribute it around the country, and the warehouse blows up, you don't get any compensation. There's no insurance payment for you. Now, that's a big problem. You go bust, basically.
Hits
so there's a lot
in the pocket. Yeah.
There's a lot of unhappiness on Telegram about that.
And fascinating, isn't it, that going back to your point about the visual signals and Trump, these Wildberry warehouses burn very well because of the amount of packaging in them. You see the images of these great columns of black smoke, black humor as well, the memes from Ukrainians, the Russian economy is moving to the cloud, that kind of thing. It sends a powerful signal in that sense as well, which of course is all part with Ukrainians facing an absolutely grim winter in which they have no means of shooting down incoming Russian ballistic missiles. The drones, they've got lots of ways of bringing them down, but of keeping the national spirit going, I think, that they have a means of bringing the war home to the Russian public as well.
And also, let's not forget that just yesterday, 17 Ukrainians in Kyiv alone were killed by ballistic missile strikes, and I think 45 injured or so. I think it was the deadliest night for the capital since the beginning of the year, and it's been a really bad year. And I think July was the worst month for aerial bombardments in terms of casualties since the very beginning of the war 4.5 years ago. And again, because the war's gone on for so long, and I'm sad to say some eyes, hopefully not on this podcast, glaze over when you talk about Ukraine, because it's become, it's gone on longer than the First World War. It's a matter of routine. I mean, from those colleagues and friends who are in Kyiv, it's a nightmare. So these nightly air raid sirens, people are down, in the bunker or in the tube stations that are deep underground, especially in Kyiv, built, ironically enough, for, an American nuclear threat in the Soviet era. That's tiring, and that must be very, torture for these poor people. And of course, yesterday, I think the nocturnal attack, maybe 2 nights ago, it's fuzzy. Anyway, this week, the worst night, when there's 17 people died, not a single Russian missile was shot out of the sky by an interceptor. Bad news. I mean, I guess, well, you know this better than most people. Wars are won not just on, how many people you kill, but also which economy prevails, who's won the economic war. And I think that's really important, don't you?
Absolutely. And the deep strike campaign targeting clearly the energy sector in Russia, and has been for months, and now the retail and commercial sector, it's clearly designed to have an economic effect. And I guess what we need from our guest is a sense of, is it working?
Well, let's bring in our guest for this edition of the Fourcast Indicators this week. It is Timothy Ash. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House in their Russia and Eurasia program, and also an economist. Welcome to the podcast, Timothy. Let's start talking about the economy then. I mean, we've been chewing the fat, Mark and I, about wild berries and all sorts of other things that weren't really household, concepts until recently. I mean, the attacks on these warehouses in Russia is quite dramatic. How much has it hurt the Russian economy, and which part of it?
Well, the economy was already struggling. We'd seen an intensification of Western sanctions middle of last year that had really undermined oil and energy imports late last year. Unfortunately, early this year, the fiscal deficit was already, first couple of months was already at the full year target. The economy was near to recession. Inflation was quite high. The current account of trade positions were deteriorating. Then we had the Iran war, which was kind of manna from heaven for Putin, a bit of a get out of jail card there. And those numbers became a bit better, but the economy was still struggling, right? I mean, this is an economy 4 years into the war, guns versus butter trade-offs, running very, very, flat out basically, and struggling to generate resources for the military machine. The Wildberries attacks are really interesting. I think the impact of this is going to be on multiple levels. One, it brings the war home to ordinary Russians. It disrupts them in terms of buying their ordinary products. It will create shortages. It will create higher inflation. For those companies that rely on the Wildberries for their supply chain, it will disrupt their production, which again will cause more shortages and more difficulties for Russian consumer. And then the other thing is, a lot of individual traders have lost a lot of stock, billions of dollars, perhaps as much as $10 billion of stock through the attacks on Wildberries. And that will cause bankruptcies. It will cause problems in the banking sector, non-performing loans, put strains on the banks, and then come back through the macro through lower growth, probably a weaker currency ultimately.
Right. And just quickly on the supply chain, I mean, the Ukrainians are saying that these Wildberry warehouses are used for the military supply chain, but then they also mention things like, wet wipes for the front line, or body armor, or things, various things that people need. I mean, how legitimate is the military argument there, or is it actually mainly a civilian thing?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, like the Ukrainians also use the internet and these, similar Amazon-style entities to supply the front lines. That's just the nature of, I guess, modern military supply chains and warfare, right? But I think importantly here, right, I think the economics of this and the social dimension, political dimension is really important. It's kind of why the Ukrainians have been hitting refineries, right? It's not only about limiting revenues to the budget and the balance of payments in terms of funding the war, but it's also about making the ordinary Russians understand that there is a price and a cost for this conflict, right? The fact that Russians are queuing up for petrol, it's painful. You see online, if you look at the Telegram channels, lots of whinging by Russians, like, how can this happen? And the Ukrainians want that, right? I mean, there is state Duma elections coming up in September. The Ukrainians want this war to stop, and how better than to, make the Russian population uncomfortable enough that they could do something about it, right? They perhaps take matters into their own hands. A Prigozhin-style coup would be an ideal scenario from a Ukrainian perspective. So, yeah, absolutely. It's making the Russian population suffer for the war that's been conducted in their name by Putin in Ukraine.
Tim, you've woven a convincing thread there between the Wildberries warehouses and the petrol lines and all of those things in terms of bringing the reality to the Russian people that there's a war on and that they're going to sacrifice too if the war continues. But of course, Putin is notoriously indifferent to public opinion. We saw protests at the beginning of the war, harshly repressed. He doesn't seem to respond to changes in public opinion very much. Is there an argument for saying, and you mentioned Prigozhin, that the real targets of these strikes, these deep strikes, are the bosses of these big industries, whether they're energy, distribution, manufacturing, the sort of people who might begin to think that it's time to put pressure on Putin for a change? Does that work as well, the sort of oligarchs and the elite in that sense?
Maybe it's overly optimistic to assume something like Prigozhin or the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I wouldn't rule it out, right? And I think the Ukrainians, if anyone understands how Russians think, it's the Ukrainians. And I think bringing the war home to ordinary Russians is a stress point for Putin. Something else that was quite interesting in the last couple of weeks, actually, was the president of Kazakhstan, to Kyiv, came to Moscow. Well, not Moscow. He came to Omsk to a conference, had a press conference with Putin, and read the riot act almost to Putin. Quite extraordinary. Basically told Putin, questioned the war, why the war had happened, what are you doing? It'd be better to bring the war to an end. The relationship between Kazakhstan and Russia is an interesting one, but Kazakhstan is vulnerable in its own right to Russian power. There's no way that a Kazakh president would have come to Russia and said such comments in a public domain unless someone else was encouraging to do so. And I think the Chinese or even the Americans were behind that.
Right.
I think they encourage. I think now this war is kind of uncomfortable, for the Chinese as well. It's kind of gone on a long time. I think the Chinese themselves are nervous that, the momentum has been with the Ukrainians in the last few months. The attacks on those refineries, what's happening in the Black Sea. The nightmare for the Chinese is a Soviet-style collapse, right? If this war goes on too long, that actually the Russian Federation itself is under threat because of social or political unrest. That's not what the Chinese want. And I think we've reached a point where the Chinese are very nervous. And again, that comment by the Kazakh president, I would think would have been a message from the Chinese. Now, whether or not Putin wants to listen to that, that's another question. But I think elites around Russia must be questioning the logic of this. Don't think 4.5 years of a two-week war, 1 million casualties, talks of now troop shortages on the front, perhaps a move to greater mobilization after the state Duma elections, which will bring the war home to ordinary Russians in big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Most of those casualties so far have been in poorer regions of Russia in the south, a majority Muslim population states or regions, I should say. And, the really politically important cities historically in Russia and the Soviet Union was always Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the longer this war goes on, the more mobilization, the more not ordinary, actually, elites from Moscow and St. Petersburg get killed, but, the more likely Putin is to do something different.
A lot of the problems with manpower, again, come back to money and compensating the families of the fallen and offering bigger and bigger incentives to join up. Now, you mentioned before chewing through the state budget. I think people are talking about it was all gone within 5 months, the actual budgeted amount. Can you just sort of sum up where you think Russia is now with this campaign of strikes against the oil refineries, the effect on their income, and does that mean that at some point in the next few months, Putin reaches a budget crunch where he either has to fundamentally change the paradigm. I mean, you've talked about the paradigm shift of mobilization, but in budgetary terms, can he go on?
Well, I mean, the oil revenues to the state budget are driven by a number of things, right? I mean, they're driven by the international oil price. They're driven by Russia's ability to export, and they're driven by Western sanctions, right? And we have this oil price cap imposed by the G7. We had more aggressive sanctions from the Trump administration in terms of imposing sanctions on Rosneft and Sibneft, two big Russian oil companies. I mean, what we've seen is oil revenues kind of peaked early after the full-scale invasion, right? I mean, they were running, they've halved basically since then, right? And that's a reflection of the success of those sanctions. Oil prices moderated before the Iran war. So Russia was really struggling in the early part of this year. The Iran war was, again, as I mentioned before, that really helped the Russians out significantly, right? Because the
price went up.
Urals, yep. I mean, Urals, the Russian oil blend, was no longer trading at a discount to Brent and WTI, the international oil blends, but was trading at a premium, right? I mean, and so what happens actually with the Iran war is really, really important, right? And actually, one of the drivers perhaps for Russia to settle was, a scenario perhaps beyond the Iran war where imagine that there is a resolution. I mean, I know that's quite difficult to consider now, but let's say there's a normalization somehow in the Gulf. What we saw as a result of the Iran war was a splintering of OPEC. UAE left. UAE wants to pump like crazy. And if the net result of the Iran war is lower global growth, demand destruction for oil, lower demand for oil, plus countries like UAE pumping like crazy and a supply war that Russia can't compete in because the Ukrainians are stopping them producing and exporting through their attacks, then Russia suffers through lower global oil prices, less exports because of the Ukrainians. That's the killer blow, and that's the nightmare scenario for the Russians.
And Timothy, we know that Vladimir Putin needs a lot of money to fight this war, also because he has to pay lots of soldiers who are getting killed at an extraordinary rate on the front line. So I just wonder whether you think if he were to go for a general mobilization, how would that work? I mean, would it be a mobilization order with minimal compensation? Would it be a mobilization order with the same amount of money that previous soldiers have got, or perhaps even more money? Or if they're not going to pay the money, they would have to obviously, take people to the front line, probably at gunpoint, because a lot of them don't want to die. And they certainly don't want to die if they're from Moscow and St. Petersburg. How do you see that working economically?
Well, the advantage that Russia has is it can print money, right? So in a way, the banks are state-owned. They're kind of directed to do whatever. They'd be directed to fund the budget, but it'd mean more monetary issuance by the central bank, more inflation. Ultimately, everyone in Russia would suffer through a real depreciation of standards of living, in effect, right, because of inflation. So there are no easy choices for Russia, right? The sanctions mean that it can't borrow externally. A bigger budget deficit can be funded, but ultimately it means higher inflation, probably lower growth. So one way or another, the money will be found. But there are difficult choices and consequences of doing that. I mean, I think in terms of the mobilization, will be a bit of everything. I mean, they'll have to continue to still pay people, significant salaries to be on the front line. I mean, one of the big challenges for Russia going forward, anyway, is and the fiscal challenge is the longer term costs of this war. In terms of you've got a million plus, maybe a couple of million participants in the war, which will demand war pensions and social payments after the war. I mean, that's going to be a huge drag on the Russian economy the longer the war goes on.
Timothy Ash, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Timothy. Fascinating.
My pleasure.
Well, let's put Russia and Ukraine to one side then, Mark. I mean, the other big thing we're waiting for, of course, is if there's a deal to reopen yet again the Strait of Hormuz. Has the memorandum of understanding got any life in it? Has it been rewritten, rejigged? Is it just about the strait now? And if they do organize a deal, does it then enshrine into an eternity, the principle that you can charge some money if you're the Iranian regime at the Strait?
Well, even allowing for the dangers of prediction, I think almost certainly yes. I mean, every leak we've heard about the details of this agreement involve payments. All the leaks involve some kind of payments by people wishing to go through the Strait. And
calling it a maintenance fee, a toll, also security fee. It's basically
environment.
It's protection money. It's good mafia-style protection money.
It is absolutely.
You pay us or we can't guarantee your safety.
Totally. Nice tanker you've got there.
Yeah.
Shame if something were to happen to it. No, it's totally protection money. And it's been fascinating. The Omanis, who of course have the coast on the south side of the Strait, have been under this terrible pressure from all sides for the past couple of months. The Americans saying, don't do any deal that enshrines tolls, and the Iranians saying, oh, you will, we will have tolls. And it does seem that they're bending towards that Iranian position, although in the reported negotiation, they want a 3% toll and the Iranians want a 7% toll or something, value of the cargo, something like that. So you see these rival leaks about who's trying to make it less painful to the commercial operators going through the Strait. But it will be a very significant change in that part of the world, and one that the Gulf states will absolutely, they'll pay. Of course they will.
They will. It's worth remembering also, Iran, they could basically solve their oil revenue problem through the Strait of Hormuz by turning that into a toll gate. And what's more, if people buy into it, that's there to stay. It's a much more stable source of income than oil. And it doesn't take an awful lot to remind people of what's at stake. The occasional drone fired here and there. And by the way, just one more point. What does that then do to the Straits of Malacca? Or the Straits, or indeed the Taiwan Straits? It sets a precedent that is really quite dangerous for free global maritime trade.
I think, though, given the seething anger of the Saudis, Qataris, Kuwaitis, Emiratis, this idea of developing, what they call resilient structures and all the rest of it, i.e. more pipelines, a railway line they're talking about as well to the Mediterranean, I think these ideas will crystallize. We've already seen a bit of that. So then the question will be, and I think you're right, that it's quite possible that the Iranians will still do the occasional strike to remind people, like the classic protection racket, to remind people that trying to sneak through without paying is not an option. Will they then also attempt to sabotage the Red Sea route or the Suez Canal route in the way we've seen in recent weeks as they've been trying to leverage their negotiation? Will that carry on as well? Because that then has really big implications. If, on the other hand, things become more normal, and some of these big Arab oil producers develop their plans for pipelines and railways and all the rest of it, then bit by bit, that Hormuz toll will become less and less valuable.
Did you just say normal? That our producer just whispered into my ear some breaking news. Apparently the Houthis have attacked Saudi military deployments. So we know that the Saudis were thinking of encroaching on Houthi territory in Yemen. Both by sea and by land. And I'm not sure exactly what they've hit, but maybe we're into the next stage of that war that was waiting to erupt. Care to comment?
Well, I think they hit a Saudi tanker yesterday, by the way.
A tanker, yeah. But
yes, but in terms of the Saudi military, a lot of speculation, I think, in that part of the world is about who will do what to whom next. So that's one possibility, that the Houthis and the Saudis will come into direct conflict. Another possibility that is much talked about is the Saudis and Emiratis burying their differences between them and injecting a lot of funding into the recognized Yemeni government to raise new armies to go and attack the Houthis. And that's been going on too in recent weeks, mobilization by the Yemeni government. So the Houthis may have reason to think they're about to get caught between the Saudi army and the government army. Clearly, if that conflict persists, all bets are off in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
That's it for the indicators.
Until the next time.
Until the next time. Goodbye. Thanks for joining us.